Do you have giants? You have giants in your life? We're starting a series called True Story. And what we're going to do is open up a kid's Bible story. And we're going to begin there with what a lot of us that were born and raised in the church, and I think even people who weren't raised in the church, you know a lot of these stories because they've kind of become folk culture stories. David and Goliath is one of the most common. There's probably a lot of people that have heard of the idea of a David and Goliath and didn't even know it came from the Bible. So we're going to talk about some of these stories. We're going to do that through the month of November. Then we're going to pause and we're going to do our Christmas stuff, which is going to be amazing. And then in January, we're coming back to True Story. And we'll just stay there until we think that God tells us to move on. Today is 1 Samuel 17, which, would it be okay if I read the Jesus Storybook Bible version? So glad to have you here today, neighbors. All right, I'm going to read it. All right. This is the story of the young hero and the horrible giant. God's people had some scary enemies, but the Philistines were the scariest of them all. And now the Philistines had come to fight them. The Philistines had a secret weapon called Goliath. Goliath was a terrifying soldier and, worst of all, a giant. A giant so strong and so tall and so scary that no one had ever been able to fight him and live to tell the tale. So there they were, the Philistines standing on top of one hill, God's people standing on top of the other. And every day Goliath came out and shouted, "Send your best soldier to fight me." If he went, it's hard for a man with my stature to do a Goliath voice. I think I'm pulling it off though. "If he wins, we will be your slaves. But if I win, you will be our slaves." No one spoke, no one moved. "Chickens," Goliath bellowed. "Your God can't save you." His beady, greedy eyes glowered. Is that a word? What does it mean? Can you do it right now? Can you? Oh, man. They glowered at him. At them hungry. Gleared? It's spelled glowered. There's a lot of affirmation on glowered here. A lot of glowering for me to move on in the story. What's the Hebrew root of glowered? His beady, greedy eyes glowered at them hungrily from under his horrible helmet, as if any minute he might really just gobble them all up. And he laughed a terrible laugh. Ha, 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 ha. It boomed, echoing horribly around and around the dry valley. Well, Goliath might as well just been a green slimy monster with 3 heads, because God's people froze with fear. Their eyes glazed over and they turned deathly pale. They knew if someone didn't do something quick, if someone didn't save them, but God would do something. He would send someone to save them. Now, you remember David was the youngest son of Jesse? Well, his brothers were soldiers in the army. One day when David brought his soldiers their lunches, he saw Goliath and how scared everyone was. "Don't be afraid," David said. "I'll fight him for you." "You're only a little shepherd boy," the king said. Oh, that's the king. Let me do the voice different. "You're only a little shepherd boy," the king said. "And Goliath is a great soldier. How will you fight him?" "God will help me," David said. So the king gave David his royal armor to wear, but it was too heavy and too big, and David couldn't walk. "I don't need this," David said. Instead, David picked out 5 smooth stones from the stream, 1, 2, 3, 4, took a slingshot, walked towards Goliath, step, step, step. It turns this way. Goliath walked toward David, thud, thud, thud. "You?" Goliath peered down at the small boy. "I'm little," David shouted up to him, "but God is great," church says. Amen. Goliath laughed an even terribler laugh than usual. Ha, 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 it went. With just one swing of the giant's sword, Goliath could finish the boy off, but David kept going. "It isn't how strong you are or how many swords and spears you have that will save you. It is God who saves you. This is God's battle, and God always wins his battles." David put a stone in his sling, swung it around and let it go. The little stone flew whiz like a bullet through the air and struck Goliath thud right between the eyes, and Goliath stopped laughing. He stumbled, and he staggered, and crash, he fell dead. When the Philistines saw Goliath was dead, they ran away, and when God's people saw them running away, they cheered. God had saved his people. David was a hero. Wow. That is the story that I remember. And I remember as a kid, I'm going to need this space. I remember as a kid hearing that story and as a little boy thinking, what did I take away from it? With God, I can take on anything. It doesn't matter what life gives me. It doesn't matter how big and scary it is. With God, I can take it on. I just need to trust him. As I grew up, it was a couple of years ago. I don't know if any of you know who Malcolm Gladwell is. Got one of the biggest podcasts in the world called Revisionist History. I love listening to him. Not a Christian, but a fascinating thinker. And he wrote a book called David and Goliath and has this TED Talk. It's about 15 minutes long about David and Goliath. And I went back and listened to it again for the sake of preparing for this. And he makes two big points there. It's these adult eyes looking at a children's story. And the two big points that he makes are, number one, this is not necessarily a story about God working through a man. This is a story about the difference between infantry and artillery, which he makes a good point. I'm not saying that God's not in the story, but that is a part of the story. Goliath says, "Come to me." He's wearing all this armor. He is a specific kind of soldier in the army. He's called infantry, and he wants to fight muscle to muscle, hand-to-hand combat. And David comes down and obviously has no interest in that because David is not fighting a style of warfare called infantry. He's fighting slinger, which is what we would know as artillery. And he comes down with his slingshot, which he tells the king he's practiced with. He's killed lions and tigers and bears. Thank you. Now, one of the points that Malcolm Gladwell makes is that this is not just a little kid with a stone, that if you get good with that slinger, you can swing that thing at 6 revolutions a second. It's accurate up to 200 yards, and with the small stones that they would have found in that valley, it hits with the stopping power of a .45 pistol. He shot Goliath in the head. So that's the point Malcolm Gladwell is making. The second point he makes is there are some things in there about Goliath that they are a little suspect, that maybe he has a vision problem. I'll give that. But he makes the point that he has giantism, which is acromegaly. Is that what it's called? Is that it? Acromegaly? Yes. It's a condition where there's a growth on the pituitary gland that you can't stop growing. And there have been people, some of them have played in the NBA. There have been people who have had these. Anybody ever heard of the wrestler Andre the Giant? He had acromegaly. So one of the problems is because that's putting pressure there, it does cause pressure on your vision, and you can lose blurry vision or have just only nearsightedness. So he makes these arguments, and as I remember hearing this a couple of years ago, and I thought, been a while since I've been back to David and Goliath. There's got to be more there. What's there? And then I thought about you. And I thought about how much I love being your pastor. And I thought about my friends, our other pastors. And I thought about what we know about your giants. And how much our heart hurts for the giants in your valley. What do we do about giants? I'm going to ask 4 questions. First question, what does the presence of a giant cause? Do you have a giant in your life? The very presence of a giant. In fact, when I asked you at the beginning, do you have a giant? Many of you immediately, I know his name. I know what he yells at me. I know what time of day he likes to come down and taunt me. I know my giant. When you have a giant in the valley, it causes something within you. And I think the first thing that just the presence of a giant in your life causes is a miscalculation of the battle. Goliath emboldens the Philistines. They are not that confident. If you look in verse 51, they run away. The moment that they don't have their giant, they take off. We miscalculate our battles sometimes because we see one giant and we add to it an army of everything that might be close to it, and then we try to face the entire army when really it's just the one giant. If the one giant were to be defeated, the whole rest of the army is so weak they're going to take off. But we don't typically think about that when the giant is present. We just get scared of the giant and we look to the hill behind it and say, I'm not only facing this giant in my life, I'm facing this giant and the whole army behind it. It's me versus the world, and that's the miscalculation that we carry. How else do we miscalculate? Goliath becomes a psychological snowball. Look at the way that the Israelites are talking. Skip down to verse 25. It says, now the Israelites had been saying. That means that they're saying it over and over and over. Goliath's down there for 40 days. And what's the internal and the external dialogue? How do the Israelites talk to one another? They keep talking about the giant. That's all they're talking about. Over and over. Do you see how this man keeps coming out? He comes out to defy Israel. And then they talk about what they're going to get if they beat him, but none of them are going down to fight him. The people are talking about the giant, even though nobody's fighting the giant. You look down to verse 27. After David comes and asks them a question, it says, they repeated. Oftentimes, giants get bigger because we can't stop talking about them. We miscalculate because these Goliaths in our life cause a psychological snowball. And everybody we meet, how you doing? Well, here's what and we build it, we repeat it again. We go through the whole story again, and this psychological snowball just gets bigger and bigger and heavier and heavier. The Israelites, in fact, completely missed the point. They're talking about getting wealthy. They don't even know how to win. None of them are going down to fight. They're excited that apparently they're going to get wealth and all this stuff, and none of them are going down to fight. They don't even know what a win is anymore. Under the stress of the presence of a giant, we are likely to miscalculate the battle. We're also likely to mistrust those around us. When a giant is around, we get scared and we rein it in. We get tight in here because of the stress and pressure of the giant. So David's oldest brother in verse 27, we have no idea where this comes from. There is no backstory for this interaction between David and his older brother. Verse 28, when Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard him speaking with the men, he burned with anger at him. All he did was ask, verse 26, what will be done for the man who kills the Philistine and removes the disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of Israel? And there's so much stress and pressure inside David's older brother, who's been on the front line, but he hasn't fought. He's just up there every day, terrified and looking down at this giant, that even when he just hears his brother come and ask a question, David never said, I can beat him. David has not said, I'm better than you. David hasn't said, he's not that scary. What's wrong with you? You're filled with fear. David didn't say any of that. All David said is, what's going on? And Eliab is paralyzed in fear after 40 days of looking down at the same giant, that he burns with anger at his own brother. I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle. What are you talking about, man? We mistrust those around us when we are scared of the giants in our lives. King Saul, same thing. Says later in chapter 18 that Saul has slain his thousands. Saul is a proven warrior and has all of the equipment that he needs, and Saul didn't go down there, so Saul is not doing anything either. He is mistrusting. David's father isn't even present. Notice that when the giant is there, None of the people who are scared by the giant trust each other. Under the stress of the presence of a giant, we're likely to push away our advocates and to isolate from those that we lead because we misplace our fear and we self-protect. Church, can I tell you something that's true? Giants may cause us to miscalculate and isolate, but giants can fall, and you are not alone. You are not alone. What does the presence of a giant cause? What is God's approach to a giant? Now that's interesting. I think that Malcolm Gladwell is right when he points out the infantry versus the artillery. Because one of the ways that we see God frequently take down giants is by creativity over brute force. When I see giants in my life, things that come against me, my reaction is, I want to crush it. I don't want it there. If it came against me like this, I'm going to defeat it like this. I will go down into the valley and I will take up my sword, even though I am weaker, even though I am not as strong, even though I don't have the training, even though I have no confidence. If it's coming down, that's how I'm going to have to come down. I guess I'm going to have to beat it. And what it feels like in your life is just take the pain away. No matter what you have to do, I don't want to feel this anymore. This giant in my valley has to go away. And it doesn't matter by what means, it doesn't matter what I have to do, I just need it to be gone. And that's brute force. Just take it away. God often doesn't do that. He often finds an alternative creative route that's not something we would have thought of. And it's frequently slow. 40 days? God could have arranged for, let me explain the situation. There are two hills. And on one hill are the Israelites, and on the other hill are the Philistines, and there's a valley in between. Nobody wants to go into that valley, because if you're an Israelite and you send troops down into that valley, you're just standing here saying, we're in the wide open, come get us. That's a bad spot to be. They don't want to come down either, because if they come down, all you have to do is use your slingers and take them out. You have high ground on them now. So they've been at a stalemate for a very long time. After the stalemate, that's when the Philistines decided to send one down and challenge them to send one down so we can all spare all of our soldier friends. Sometimes in our lives, we get to the place where we have been here for so long, looking down, that we can only think of one way to go after that giant. But we've been living life with that giant down there for a long time. And God's answer was not to send David down immediately, because he was using those 40 days to teach them. And God's answer was not to send David down with a sword. God uses creativity. God will frequently choose laughably slow, creative methods to deal with your giants and test your faith and prove his capacity. What is God's approach to giants? Creativity over brute force, and willingness equals readiness. There were lots of ready people in this story. The Israelites were ready. They were proven warriors who had won before. They had all the equipment, all the training. They had strategy. They were an army. They were ready. King Saul was ready. This was not his first encounter with a big physical challenge like this. They were ready, but they weren't willing. And David was willing, which made him ready. If you are willing, you are ready. God uses the willing because they are ready. I got to this point in the study, and I realized that something was being told to me about this story that flipped the entire thing on its head. Will I enter the valley of my giant? That's the question we're all wondering. I know what my giant is. Will I enter that valley? And as I began pondering that question, I realized that we typically talk about that giant as a circumstance in our life. That giant is a real person in my life. That giant is a real place in my life. That giant is a real situation or something that I've got to deal with in this world. That's how we often talk about David and Goliath. In fact, last night I watched Notre Dame beat up on Clemson. And before the game, Clemson is supposed to destroy. They're number 4 in the country. We're wobbly at best. And before the game, in order to get the psychology of our team right, the coach says, this is not a David versus Goliath. Because he knows we're looking at Clemson as the Goliath. Just like you have things in your life, circumstances that you're calling a Goliath. His attack was not against Clemson. His attack was against Notre Dame's mentality. Your Goliaths are not your circumstances. The name of the giant in this story is not Goliath. It's fear and faithlessness. The true battle was not happening in the valley. It was happening on the mountaintop within them. And they had lost for 40 days. They lost to themselves and couldn't even go down to Goliath. That's the real Goliath then. In 1610, an Italian painter in the Baroque style painted a painting called David and Goliath, and his name was Caravaggio. And if you look at this painting, which I had prepared to put on the slide, and it's gruesome, so I didn't. You can look it up if you would like to. It shows David with a somber face holding the head of Goliath after the battle is over. Now, what you don't know is that the face of Goliath is a self-portrait of the painter. And the face of David is a self-portrait of him in his youth. Caravaggio is using the story of David and Goliath, saying his greatest Goliath is him. The scariest giant in your life is you. That is the upside down of the story. It is not the circumstances that face you. It is your capacity to respond to life in a healthy way. Goliath is usually the circumstances in front of us. Your giants are not your circumstances, but your capacity to respond in a healthy way. Giants are not people. Can I prove it to you? Turn to Luke 6. Now this is all through Jesus' teaching. It's all through the New Testament. Jesus turns this upside down all the time. But in Luke 6, this is Luke's version of the Beatitudes. And if you look in Luke 6, he says, he refers to giants, what we would call giants. These are circumstances that we face. People who hate us, curse us, mistreat us, slap us, take things from us. We say, those are my giants. I have people in my life who mistreat me. I know her name. That's my Goliath, and I've got to figure out a way to face my Goliath. I might just be a little David, but this Goliath in my life who mistreats me, I will defeat her because God is in my... No, that is not what Jesus teaches. What Jesus teaches is, bless those who curse you. So your giant is not the person who curses, it's your ability to bless people who curse you. That's the real giant. Says it again and again. Who is the giant? The one who hates you? No. Your ability to do good to those who hate you. Is your giant those who curse you? No. It's your capacity to bless those who curse you. Is your giant those who mistreat you? No. It's your capacity to pray for those who treat you. Is your giant people who slap you? No. Turn the cheek. That's your real Goliath. We see it all through Scripture. Nehemiah was not faced with a Goliath that was a wall. Nehemiah was faced with believing that God could use a butler to build it. That's the real giant in the room. Sarah was not faced with the giant of pregnancy. Sarah was faced with trust that her God would use an old barren woman. Gideon was not faced with a giant of victory that was improbable. He was faced with acceptance that he was not too weak. Mary was not faced with the giant of the birth of Messiah. She believed that. She was faced with believing that there would be a miracle in a virgin and accepting her own worthiness. And Simon was not faced with the giant of believing in the divinity of Jesus Christ. He believed in that. He was faced with the internal battle, fulfillment of his role as Peter, not Simon. Your giants are not your circumstances, but your capacity to respond in a healthy way. And I, right now, am preaching to myself. I know the giants that you're going through, some of them, and you know the giants that you think I'm going through. But I realized in preparing for this sermon that my circumstances and Jade's circumstances and our family's circumstances at this moment are not my giant. I did not lose to that giant. The giant that I have lost to for a week. I came last Sunday and I could barely see straight. I don't remember who I talked to. I felt displaced. I felt weird. Because I have been losing to a different giant. It's the giant of emotional healthiness, fatherly stability, and selfless support. I lost to that one. That's the giant in my valley that I have to face. Because the giant of this moment will pass, but the giant of this moment will just find another circumstance. The giant that is within you is the giant you're carrying around. And every moment circumstance that you're facing, you're adding a second giant. It's not just the giant of today, it's adding the giant of my weakness, the place where Jesus Christ himself wants to make me whole. This season of my life and your life will pass, but will I be different in the next season? You can be. I want to be. Do you want to be? As God slays the giants within us, we're better equipped to confront the giants outside of us. And now the question, what happens when giants fall? This giant fell. Chapter 18 tells us David kept winning. He kept winning. Whatever mission Saul sent him on, David was so successful that Saul gave him a high rank in the army. People are singing about how much he's winning. The Goliath moment passed, but because of the way David handled it, he was equipped as a person to go into more battles. Anxiety taunts you from the valley. Anxiety has been down there bragging for years. Have you been frozen up on the hill saying, maybe tomorrow I'll go down? And you're going through life thinking that it's this circumstance and it's this circumstance and I just don't have the relationships I want and I don't have the confidence in these places that I want. My Goliath is that I want to go and I want to do this. No, that's a circumstance. The Goliath is your anxiety, which belongs at the altar. You have to come down. Has fear gripped your life? and it stands in the valley and it taunts you for 40 days. And you need to go down and fight. Will you take up a sword? I hope not. God fights in creative ways and never expects you to fight under your own power. Again and again, David says, listen, I beat the lion, and I beat the bear, but I'm fighting in the name of the Lord. And so I can fight any giant, even the most scary ones, which are in here and in here. Loneliness taunts you from the valley. Discouragement taunts you from the valley. Hidden addictions are taunting you from the valley, saying you're too weak. If you tell anyone that I'm even taunting you from the valley, you've already lost, because people will betray you and deny you. Those are lies from the giant in the valley. Grief taunts you from the valley, saying you'll never make it out, you'll never be happy again. You are lost and different forever. And you might say, you don't know what I have gone through. You don't know my giant. I can't fight it. If you say, I can't fight it, then the name of your giant is you again, because God never asked you to fight it. We can fight it with you together, and God wants you to fight it under His power. Don't raise your hand today and say, I will fight my giant. Raise your hand today and say, Christ in me is a conqueror, more than a conqueror, Paul says in Romans 8. If God is for us, who can be against us? Don't be afraid, be filled. Don't be afraid, be filled. So here's how we're going to finish. We have the opportunity at the outside for communion. If you're a believer in Jesus Christ and you're alive in Jesus Christ, then take that life into your body. Don't fight it with your own strength. Be filled with the life of Jesus Christ. And this fights giants, the ones that are within us, so that we can fight the ones that are without us. If you want to go, and we're going to be a little bit more casual and informal today, if you want to go out and take communion out here together, but if you want to come down to the altar and you're thinking, today is the day I think I'm going down. Jesus, am I going down? I'm going down to fight the giant that I have not even acknowledged, even though he taunts me every day. I'm going down to fight it. And you don't need to fight that alone. If you want to pray alone about it, use the middle altar. If you want hands laid on you, come to the outside altar. If you want to go and get communion and say, I'm going to make a note to myself before I go fight my giant that I don't fight it under my own strength. I'm going to fill my diet. I'm going to fill my belly so that I digest and process the life of Jesus Christ in my chest. And then under that power and under that life, I'm going to the altar and I'm fighting the giant. No more will he taunt me. Whatever you want to do, you have an 8-minute song, I've been told. You have 8 minutes. We'll make it 9 if we need to. Let's stand together and let's worship and process this moment and whatever is the healthiest for you.